Okay, welcome back to part 2. Perfect, everything seems to be working. We are live. Okay, so we talked about making your own video games, websites, and apps, and we talked about that it's just kind of like a user experience, and we also talked about set and get. So what we're going to do now is we're actually breaking it down into all the individual parts and pieces. So we know that we have the actual human user, that's somebody who exists somewhere, and that person does set and get operations for, just thinking about it this way right now, that person does set and get operations on that experience that you create for them. So the machinery, the processes, the functions, and the files and infrastructure that you create that allow the user to set and get stuff on that machine, be it the remote machine or the local machine, right? Doesn't matter. This machinery, at the end of the day, just kind of makes data and information kind of meaningful and pretty and readable to the human. So that's really what's going on here. So on a big level overview, that's the cycle happening. Now, if we look at some more details, there's one layer in between here. That's the actual input-output devices, right? So that's the hardware that your person is using, be it a phone or whatever computer they have, or maybe some VR device, who knows. And then set and get here is even kind of unclear, because sometimes setting one thing means getting the same thing on the other side. So it's really, you can't really separate them so well anymore. But at the end of the day, there's still always some flow of data, because all we have is these electronic chain reactions, right? And so here, this is all the magic that you create. And by the way, I'm drafting all of this here using Lucidchart, right? So it's kind of like, I prepared a couple, but we're gonna actually do these as we go. And I also want to let you know that because some of this is so abstract and highly conceptual, that sometimes we might draw things up that make sense from one perspective, but if you look at them from another perspective, you have to completely rebuild and redraw it. Right? So sometimes just talking about coding only gets you so far, and then you have to really do the coding stuff. But right now, as we're talking about coding, just keeping that in mind, that sometimes we might explain things in one way and it kind of makes sense from this perspective, but really in reality, things are a little more complicated or a little different. This is supposed to just give you an overview and help you sort out all your knowledge. So if we have the user and their local machine, the hardware that they use, now we already know that there's a client side and a server side. Now you guys, you've been doing coding for a little bit, so what are some of the things that are happening on the server side, and what are some of the things that are happening on the client side? In fact, let's start with the client side. Your first lesson ever, what is it that you learned? What can we put on the client side? Because in your first lesson, you didn't do anything on the server yet, right? So what is kind of the thing that was going on the client side when you first started learning code?
Well, if I may add, the actual web page itself, ironically, the actual file, the HTML file is actually running on the client side.
Very good. The HTML
HTML,
file.
which includes CSS and JavaScript.
Mm-hmm. So anybody want to comment on kind of like the difference between a file and a programming language?
A file can be filled with any programming language. A file is the vessel of programming languages, or even multiple programming languages.
I mean, I would add that it doesn't necessarily have to be a programming language, just be literal text. But I mean,
how much storage does an empty file take, like on Windows?
Theoretically infinite, assuming that your computer can handle infinite.
If you right-click and create a file, how much space does that take up?
Nothing until you add stuff in it.
No,
it actually takes like a few bytes. Really.
Yeah, a few bytes.
Not much.
Yeah, it's essentially just a vessel. That's all it is. It is nothing and it is everything.
Kind of empty, like everyone here.
If we talk about the files, then if we know that these files can just kind of contain anything, right? So we can say that these files could be any of these things, and HTML and CSS doesn't even need to say file here. Now, do files only exist on the client side, or are there also server-sided files?
There's also server-sided files, particularly PHP, would you consider the database a file? I mean, no, the database
Like
is made up
passwords
of
and
files.
such, those are stored in a file, like logins.
Sure, yeah. I mean, those would be stored in databases, though, right? Unless you're talking about like the Google remember your password thing, and that would be. I don't actually know if Google stores it or if it's the computer that stores it. Whatever. But a database is a collection of files, technically speaking, right? Okay. All right. Yeah. Because it's.
That's a good point right there. Right there is exactly what I was saying. Well, it's like, okay, sometimes using the term file is kind of useful, but other times it's like, the borders get blurry. I mean, of course, at some level, a database is probably some type of file as well.
But as a user, you don't access it as a file.
Right, exactly.
The file has a UI.
Exactly.
But then again, if you weren't to be able to using PHP MyAdmin, then you would probably access it using a terminal, in which case it'd be even more closer to a file. PHP MyAdmin is just a user interface. All right.
Now,
the
let
next
me
thing.
ask you this.
Yeah.
Yeah, the next thing. What were you about to say?
The HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files are stored on servers as well. It's that when you type in, say, google.com, they send you the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files for you to run onto your machine, just by HTTP generally, but although you could do it insecure. So by HTTP, all those server-sided, client-sided files are actually retrieved from the server and sent to you.
So that means we have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that also is on the server side, right? And then
Yeah, but those are never run. Those are data.
Somehow it goes to the server side, depending on how it's set up, right? Maybe you're making a game or a program that's only on the local machine, and then of course you set up your files right on that machine, and then you run them there. But if you have a website, a web server, then these files, they're somewhere on that server, and you actually access them. And so you already said, so how do we access the files and get them from the server side to the local machine? Let's hear someone else other than Colin.
Dang it.
How do we get our files from the server side to the local machine?
Was it not Ajax? Ajax.
Ajax is one method, but Ajax actually utilizes this method to transfer stuff from one to the other.
Okay.
Quinn?
Are you referring to Ajax as like a way to transfer files, or?
That's not what I'm going quite yet. So let's put Ajax aside. Okay, we'll get back to Ajax. Right. Also, speaking of technologies that we haven't addressed yet, another one that I wanted to put on is the PHP Session. Okay, so we'll talk about these later. We'll put them down here. But right now, to get one file from the server side to the client side, usually we need to have some kind of URL, right? The URL actually points to that file. So if I go to yourwebsite.com/games/mygame.html or mygame.php, right? That's the URL that I'm using to actually get to that file. And so again, this is about set and get. So something has to get the file from the server side and set the file on the client side. But also there needs to be something in between that actually sets the URL, which in most cases, in your case, when you're just starting out, it's going to be the actual human that types in the URL to get there. Let me actually change the style of this because I like them when they're rounded. There we go. Default style. Okay, so the human sets a URL, and that URL might be an HTML file from the server side, and then it gets sent to the client side, and then it's being output on the actual machine that the user uses. But what if the user doesn't want to type in their own URL? What alternative do we have? That a thing that the user can do.
My answer?
Yes, go ahead.
Hyperlink.
Hyperlink, exactly. Let me just call it link here. So if you click on a link, right? If you click on a link is always just some kind of URL that then, actually, I should probably put the arrow this way around, don't you think? Because we click on the link and
That's
then
true.
we get this guy. Well, no, let's
Maybe you
put
can
it
have
this
2
way.
arrows.
Yeah, it should be multiple arrows, right? So this is the chain reaction that's happening there. Going back around to this HTML, boom. So we click the link, which takes us through a URL to some maybe HTML file, which brings the HTML file to the client side, and that's where then it comes back around to the user actually being able to see it. And of course the user, like I directly use the user, but the user does it through their local machine. So there's one chain reaction that we've just kind of visualized and illustrated better. Right? So we click on a link, there's a URL, takes us maybe to an HTML file, that HTML file gets downloaded on a client side, and then we see it right there. Now, let's talk about... I hear somebody's dad on the phone. I think it's Joshua.
Can I suggest a term?
What's
Post and get.
post and get? Oh, good one. Are they separate
Those are
terms or
pretty
are they
related.
in one box?
They're 2 methods, but they accomplish the same thing. So I would put them in the same box.
Put them in the same box. Post.
I mean, ultimately they have the same place in the chain.
Right.
It's just
Let's put them separate for right now.
like they get like it's like choosing between like UPS and FedEx.
A little bit like that. I like it. Now, either way, these things, they're actually what's called... Do you know what the general term for both of them is? Post and get?
Actually, I don't.
They're HTTP requests. I think, at least. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure they're HTTP requests, and there's other ones as well, like update and put, and essentially things that at the end of the day still do set and get, right? But the nuance of these set and get things are our different HTTP requests. And so a URL is usually actually just a get request, right? So we're getting the HTML file, and that's why it's being displayed. Now, but when it comes to a get request, what do you know about how we have used get requests so far? So with that, actually, let's switch up our HTML file to a PHP file, and then make this one the HTML here.
Well, a GET request is particularly, it can be displayed through the URL. So what it does is it basically tries to create a new URL, automatically redirect you to that URL. But the URL also contains additional information within it that the server side can then use to determine what to send you.
Mm-hmm. It's a little abstract. Can you make that more specific with maybe an example?
Well, for example, you could go to Google, right? And you can go like google.com/search, and then it could have a get, which is $search query equals blank. And basically what this does is it gives information to the PHP file of search query that the actual text that you're searching. It tells that file what you're searching, and then from that it can determine the PHP, like all that stuff in the question mark brackets, all that stuff in the PHP brackets. It's actually simplified into HTML through the echoes, and then that HTML file is actually sent to the client. And the advantage to this is the security that the client can modify whatever they want there, but if the client never has any access into modifying the files from the server. They only are able to get them from the server. Then they're never able to change anybody else's or do any funny business. And it's a security feature.
Good stuff. Any comments on that stuff so far from anyone else? So it's really, like I said, it's really tricky to kind of try to draw this all out, and it's
By the way,
like
people
a
need
very good tool
Yeah.
to do so.
it is a great tool, absolutely. I love this this flowchart system, but it's almost like an impossible task. Like I'm never going to be able to draw an exact map of how exactly computers work. At the end of the day, that's where I said, right? At some point, you're just going to have to do it on the computer for it to really work. But to get an overview of it, this may not be terrible here. So let's go through this again. So if we have a link on the client side, the user somehow clicks that link. The link actually, what it really does, it creates an HTTP request, right? With that URL in it. There's always an HTTP request, always has a URL as part of it. And in fact, I'm scrambling here. I'm not even sure if this is 100% correct how I'm saying this right now, because in a post request, we definitely have a URL, but then we also have some other data. So it's really separated in like a header and a body and who knows. But somehow
Well, basically,
URL
think
is
about it
part of
this way.
that.
Like an HTTP request is like, can I, like, it's like you calling and you're like, okay, hello, can I access my safe deposit box? It's this number, right? For like, think about it this way. Except it's not a safe deposit box. It's like public information that they can just copy to everyone, right? Or it's like going to the library and saying like, okay, can I get a copy of this book at this call number, right? That's what you're doing. And instead of books, it's actually websites. And the URL just being the call number. And GET request might be like a special thing. Like, could I get like specifically this book, which might be like on the Google search query, it might be I specifically want the Google search book, but when it's searched for funny cat videos or whatever, right? And like a post request though is like less explicit and it's not in the URL, it's separately asked. If that makes sense.
That's
yeah.
That's definitely one way to describe it, one narrative. Like I said, it's all just kind of different perspectives here to help us wrap our minds around this better and get a better picture of it and get a better overview, so that at the end we can make our own video games, websites, and apps. Now with the difference between the post and the get here, so if we have a get, then there's always like basically variables included. So get variables. And we see an example of that in this very thing that I'm in. So this one says edit, and then it's question mark, and then there's beacon flow ID equals a something something whatever, and then there's an and then page equals 0_0 hashtag. Okay, so there's some information here being sent via get, including the URL, right? So this is not even directly pointing to a file. This has the information somehow encoded in the URL, and what it results in is this thing that I see here. I don't know exactly, of course, how Lucidchart does all their stuff. This is their code, and that's the magic about server-sided code. I don't even know if these guys, if they're using PHP. Maybe they're using Python. Maybe they're using Java. Maybe they're using
Ruby.
.NET. Yeah, or it could be Ruby. Or Perl, they could be using that as well. They could be using anything here.
Node.
Now PHP is the one that we've been using, right? And so because it's a server-sided language, Colin already kind of mentioned that, because it's a server-sided language, we can never actually see on the client side the code that's running here. We can only ever see what is being output, right? So if I'm making a request on a client side, let me get rid of those again, because they're kind of like overcomplicating things for what I'm about to show here. So if I'm going with a link to a PHP file, the PHP file is always going to generate an HTML file for the client side. It's not actually going to come back as a PHP file, right? Now it's possible that maybe I'm trying to, can do this with any of these files. Any link, any URL, actually I should put here, that's more accurate. Any URL that I put might be pointing to a HTML file, to a JavaScript file, CSS file. All right, for example, when we do our Google hosted libraries, when we...
Or like even a better way, like you guys have done the view source thing before, right? Like where you do Control U.
Good one. We can do that right here on this side as well.
Inspect or view source or whatever. Point is, your computer actually can see the HTML code. It actually has it in the memory, and you could modify it. That's what inspect kind of does. So you could modify the information that you get, but the PHP file you'll never be able to modify if you don't own the server. The PHP file only gives you the HTML file, and you can tell the PHP file some stuff, but you're never going to see the code as a user for a PHP file. That's what makes it so secure.
So that's a good idea here to inspect something, right? So all these things here, they have a bunch of URLs here. Like this one goes to gstatic.com. This one goes to some other one. So lots of URLs in here. It doesn't actually nicely list all of those. Actually, the fonts we might be able to see. APIs. Oh yes, there's a JavaScript file that's actually being loaded, and I can open this in a new tab, and this is the URL to this JavaScript file. So in this case, right, my URL goes literally to a .js file, and this is the code of this JavaScript file. And when I actually visited this Google hosted library site, it loaded this particular JavaScript file to show me this website. Now the purpose of this website is actually to show me what URLs I can use and what script tags I can use. For example, if I want to get jQuery on my website here, I don't actually have to download jQuery. I can just put a script tag on my HTML file, and it goes to HTTPS. You see HTTP request, but secure, right? So it's actually encoded. And then it goes to blah, 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 jQuery.min.js. So this is the file where Google was nice enough to be like, hey, I'm going to put jQuery online and you can just use it. Just go to my URL. You don't have to upload it to your own website. You don't have to, your user to ask it to download it client side. You can just put this script tag in your HTML file and then bam, it points there. So in that case,
I mean, basically it's like going to like Google is like a gigantic library where they have this fantastic book that's called jQuery. And you're just like, hey, can I get a photocopied version of the jQuery book?
And you can download it into your memory for free, indefinitely.
And then by saying jQuery, like all that, like the whole URL, it tells the Google where that file is, and then it just returns that file right to you. And yeah, that's basically what it is.
So this jQuery file on the Google server, we actually put in our HTML file that script tag that I showed, right? And that is actually the one that points to this one.
Well, no, technically you get it. No, because from the HTML file you get it. You don't actually get it from the server.
Yeah,
you get it from the client.
From this side, right? So
and
it goes from the client and then creates this one, but I actually wrote my reference to it over here. So this is all the stuff that's going on. And it's like you can draw all the pictures for it, but at the end of the day, you just have to kind of understand it, how you can create your own chain reaction that generates that user experience that you want to create. So whatever complicated mess is in here, it can be really convoluted. At the end of the day, you just want to make sure that your user experiences those things that you want them to see.
And if I may add, I'm not 100% sure about this one, but I think Ajax, like for most of those arrows, is just the middleman. It's like just the file in between, sort of, if I remember correctly.
Let's take a look. Post and get variables. Those Let's actually get rid of those. So the difference between post and get is just that with get, it's up in the URL, and with post, it's kind of like, it's not in URL, it's hidden somewhere in there. And then you access it differently in the PHP. But let's take, before we go to Ajax, let's look at PHP Sessions real quick. Actually, no, this is kind of specific to something I had done with Joshua.
Can I come up with an analogy for PHP session?
Sure.
PHP session is the RAM to the hard drive, but for servers. It's the temporary storage of information that will be deleted after you're finished with it. Because if you don't, Quinn might know this, but like RAM is basically just like if you boot up a game, what it does is it takes all the assets and it takes all of the important stuff in the game and it puts it in your RAM, and that way it can be quickly accessed. Because quickly accessing things from system memory is not very fast. But of course, when you close out the game, all that RAM is deleted, and that's kind of what PHP session is. It's the temporary information, maybe like what you typed in the text box. That might be stored in PHP session, right? And then as soon as you close it, the PHP session variable gets deleted, and you lose all that. So it's just
Actually,
the temporary information.
Question, is the PHP session on the server side or on the client side?
It's on the server side.
It's on the server side. So,
Because it's part of the PHP, and then but the PHP session variable influences the PHP file and what it echoes, which means it influences the client side.
so it not only influences it, there is actually a direct link between the between the client and the server side when it comes to the PHP session, because I might have another client that also has their own session, right? Remember that the session might contain things like login data. Like if you're logged in as, you know, a certain user, then that is stored in your session. And so the session helps us manage between different clients as well and help distinguish them. So that when we're doing different calculations, we're like, okay, now I want to show this person whatever their username is. Well, how do I know what their username is? I knew that based on when I logged in, when I set my session variable. So that's kind of the thing that stays constant based on the client.
And in fact, the PHP session is just the fancier, upgraded version of cookies, kind of.
Of what?
PHP session is very similar to cookies. For being can be stored on the local machine or on the server. They're made to distinguish different people.
You said cookie?
Yeah, cookies.
And actually, it is a cookie. In fact, let's see over here. If I go into inspect over here, then I can go to
memory
application. Yep, there's the
memory.
cookies, and then see, like for example, this one SID, that is a session ID, and so yeah, sessions are PHP's way of doing cookies. Now I don't know if they use cookies here. I don't know if they use the PHP session here. They probably use something else. But we know that Codigy.io uses, oops, if I type it correctly.
Codig.
We know that this uses PHP and cookies and everything, right? So if I inspect it here, I should see on the application, I should see my cookie here, and there I actually see PHP session ID. And so that session ID is one of the things that helps me, or helps the computer.
But notice how it's
stuff.
notice how the value is encrypted. I think is that what it is? It's encrypted, isn't it?
I'm not sure if it's an encrypted value or if that's literally the identifier to help us manage that. Of course, it's going to be.
Well, could
like,
you modify a cookie
the
in order
thing
to
is,
falsify
could you
data?
exactly? Could you hijack this session? And that is an actual security concern to be kept in mind. But that's when we're getting into security now, like in terms of especially session hijacking is a very particular topic that we can look at and everything. But let's real quick finish up by looking at Ajax as well for right now. Okay, so when it comes to Ajax, we know it's a JavaScript thing. But Ajax kind of, what's the purpose of Ajax? Why would we do Ajax?
It simplifies things. It makes it so that we have a file that we can use to manage all of that transfer of data. Maybe when we put push data, where maybe we want it to turn from like a number into a name, right? For example, like a user ID to the username. Maybe we need to get multiple databases and we need to combine them. And there's lots of data and manipulation that needs to be made. And we want that to be compartmentalized so that there's not a gigantic file in the PHP file, like just getting your data. Just managing and making sure your data is in the right format and all that. So Ajax
certainly
kind of
does those things. Now, one of the A's in Ajax stands for asynchronous. That's actually, what does Ajax stand for? Stands for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Now, XML, HTML is a type of XML, right? So we're able to get some data, HTML-based data out of there, and we do that via Ajax. Now, in this example right here, this website that I am using, right? It's just a website actually. It would be really annoying if every time I make a click and every time I make a move, it's kind of like I would be going to another one like google.com, right? So every time I do that, it needs to load for a second. And now let's search for something. What does Ajax stand for? Sure, let's search for that. And now that kind of was one click, right? And now I click on W3 schools and it loads for a second. Now it takes me here. Now all these things, they're just like the URLs that we talked about. But Ajax keeps things on the client side, and in the background it does all of this URL loading for you. So then Ajax always requires some type of URL.
So basically it gets the URL, and then as soon as the URL is completely downloaded on the client side, then it displays it so it's instantaneous.
Not quite. So that's where you do the magic. Ajax doesn't display anything unless you tell it to display something. So Ajax requires a URL, and then it can either go to a PHP file if you want to, or to an HTML file. But let's say it goes to a PHP file, and then of course the PHP file echoes something, and then that goes back to the Ajax. And then, okay, what do you do with the Ajax? If you want to, with the Ajax, you can then modify your HTML. You could possibly even modify your CSS.
So it's a local
Or you
PHP
could
file?
modify your JavaScript. No, it's just a way to get server-sided data from the client side without actually navigating to a URL. You see the main difference here is that now we have two URL things. This URL thing originated with the human clicking something. This URL thing originated with Ajax. Of course, the Ajax
When Ajax is a redirect?
The Ajax might be initiated by the user doing something, but also it might be happening through, for example, a timer, right? It could be something else. Something in your JavaScript could be initiating that Ajax. You could be having a timer. Every 5 seconds, I want you to go to this URL, find out what we get there, and then bring it back. And with this Ajax, of course, you can also get send some data that then goes to the database. Oops.
So if you don't use Ajax, it automatically displays it as HTML, but if you use Ajax, you're able to choose what it displays as. For example, you could just want to store the information on the client side, but you could also choose to modify it, then display it as HTML.
Yeah, it's all about whatever user experience you want to create. Whatever you want your user to be like and to experience. If you sometimes you might not even need Ajax, right? You might just be able to go with URLs. One click, one refresh, and then they see something here. But like I said, this website right here that I'm using right now, it would be really annoying if every time I move something, if it had to completely reload all this stuff. Because what happens here, if I close this right now, and now I'm going back to my documents, and now I'm going back into this, it's loading everything, and it didn't forget anything, right? All this stuff got saved. but it didn't get saved because I submitted it, because I hit a button or something, but it actually got saved kind of like in the background. So in fact, we can...
Yeah, in fact, you can look at the top and it says saving, save.
Right, it says saving there, but let's take a look at the network here. Let's see, every time I do something, there was a little bit of a request. That you see that? So it kind of logs those things that are going on. Let me move something. Doesn't really do it, does it? Yeah, every time it looks like every time the green thing is going off, it might have sent something and brought it back, right? So it has done something with some URL via Ajax that I didn't even notice was going on, because for my user experience, I don't want to notice that stuff. I want the machine to do the magic all by itself. And that's how they programmed that, with some type of asynchronous probably technology, but I don't know for sure, right? Who knows what they have used. Ajax is just one technology in JavaScript that we've been using for our stuff here. All right, hopefully that gave you a little more insight and helped you connect those things that you already know, right? Because we've worked with all of these technologies, and hopefully that helps you to sort it in a little bit better of how it works and what it looks like in the big picture now. Any questions so far? No?
Nah, not really.
Also, if
Well,
you're watching
I
the
do have a
replay-
question, but I'm going to ask it at the end. Just that's completely unrelated.
Unrelated question. All right, then I'm going to stop the recording now. If somebody is watching a replay of this, feel free to post your questions in the comments below as well. And good job. I know this is a lot of difficult stuff, but over time you'll just get a better overview of this and you understand it better. So keep up the good work.